Hello and welcome to the COGIT podcast series. My name is Anthony Richards and I'm the editorial director of COGIT. Today I'm delighted to be joined by Dame Sara Khan, who was appointed in January 2018 by the Home Secretary as the first head of the Commission for Countering Extremism. She has since, in March 2021, been appointed by the Prime Minister as the government's independent advisor for Social Cohesion and Resilience, as part of government action to tackle extremism within communities. More historically, Sara was director of Inspire, an organization she co-founded in 2008 to challenge gender inequality and Islamist extremism. And in 2016, she co-authored the book, The Battle for British Islam, Reclaiming Muslim Identity from Extremism. Sara was awarded a damehood in this year's New Year's Honours List in recognition of a significant contribution to countering extremism. Dame Sara, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's my pleasure.
If I could ask firstly, what was it that prompted the creation of the Commission for Countering Extremism in the first place, and particularly perhaps the timing of it?
Well, I think many of your listeners will remember that 2017 was pretty much a significant year for terrorist attacks. There were a spate of terrorist attacks of around, I think, 5 in total. But it was after the horrific Manchester Arena attack in May, when the then Prime Minister, Theresa May, announced the creation of the Commission, an independent body that would advise government on the policies and possible powers needed to tackle extremism, what more could be done. And I think, for years, we know that government have been responsible for devising policy on counter-terrorism and counter-extremism. But I think the recognition that an independent expert body that could give new insight, new fresh thinking was desperately needed. So the Commission was set up to provide that type of advice to the government, but also fundamentally to support society to challenge all forms of extremism, because, of course, countering extremism is a whole society approach. So I think it was, a fantastic idea. And when I was at the Commission and I spoke to European colleagues, many of them were actually very, very impressed that there was an independent expert body called the Commission for Countering Extremism, whose job it was to advise government to support society to challenge extremism.
Thank you for that. And you mentioned that all forms of extremism, and perhaps inevitably one of the greatest challenges for the Commission has been to define or conceptualize extremism in the British context. How did you and the Commission go about this? What is or has been the Commission's, and indeed your own personal understanding of what extremism means? And then, from that, I guess, you try and determine the parameters of the remit of the Commission itself.
I mean, that in a nutshell, Anthony, was the challenge, and it's no insignificant challenge at all. And when I was appointed to the Commission, it was funny, I had some people actually giving me commiserations and saying, oh my God, good luck, Sara, with that one in not only defining extremism, but then defining the activity that you're now saying is counter-extremism. But I think for me, it was such an important priority to make clear on what do we actually mean by extremism. And, I say that because, you and I and many of the members of the public will know that the E word is highly contested. It's used, it's abused, it's exploited. I mean, I remember when I was in my role at the Commission, we just had the EU referendum, and I lost count actually of the number of times politicians would accuse each other of being extremists, in the Houses of Parliament. And again, I found that deeply unhelpful when there was a genuine extremism problem, whether we're talking about the Islamist threat, the far right threat, or other types of extremism. So that was the climate I was operating in. But also I was very conscious of, current and historical usage of the word. I mean, we all know that the government of the day 100 years ago labelled certain feminists as being suffragettes because of their desire and their struggle for civil liberties, the right to vote, and other human rights. We know more recently there were people like Jenny Jones, now of course Baroness Jenny Jones, who in 2014 discovered that her name was on a police domestic extremism list because of her activity, because of her green activity. So those types of challenges will continue unless you have a very clear and precise definition of extremism. And of course, you only also need to look at authoritarian and non-democratic governments to see how they actually use the name of counter-extremism and counter-terrorism, to silence dissent, to silence freedom of expression, to undermine human rights. So I think, all of those issues are huge challenges for people who are working in the counter-extremism field, and who are challenging, really dangerous extremist activity. I mean, my own personal understanding of extremism, even though I've been working in this field for such a long time, during my time at the Commission, it definitely, I definitely learned a lot what I understood extremism to be. And I'm very much of the view that it is a human and societal ill that has existed throughout time, and it will continue wherever there are human societies and civilizations. And so although the policy around tackling extremism is relatively new, extremism as a phenomenon itself is nothing new at all. And there's an excellent book by J.M. Berger, who's written a book called Extremism, who really goes into the historical times of where extremism has erupted throughout time. And it's an excellent read. But the fact of the matter is that wherever we see human societies, and rather like crime, we will continue to see extremism. What will vary is the amount of it, depending on how high or how low it is. Really depends on how resilient a society is and how robust it is in tackling and preventing extremism. I think the other thing I would say about my own personal view about extremism is that I am of the firm belief that it's not confined to a single race, religion, or ideology, precisely because it's a human and societal ill. I have seen far-right extremism, Islamist extremism, Sikh extremism, Hindu extremism, left-wing extremism, because it is a human condition. So I think when people try and say we should only focus on one type of extremism, or there's only one type of extremism, I think that's a fundamental mistake. And I think any type of counter-extremism policy has to be ideologically blind. A little bit on the issue of how did we as the Commission go about in trying to define the parameters of extremism. I mean, one thing that really struck me, that one thing that I was really keen to understand was, well, what is the British public's view? How do they define extremism? Because what I was constantly being told was, oh, it is highly contested. You'll never get consensus, that there is no consensus around the meaning of extremism. And actually, I kind of disputed that, or wondered if that wasn't actually a true assumption. So I launched a call for evidence in 2018, very much asking members of the public to give me their thoughts on what they understand extremism to be. And we had just under 3,000 responses. And all of the data we collected, we gave it to the Policy Institute at King's College London, who analysed all the data. And we said to them, can you tell us if there is consensus, or there are disagreement, or even consensus on the disagreements of what extremism is or isn't? Where are the boundaries that people think extremism is and isn't? And actually, what was really interesting was that they did find overarching consensus. And so the first thing they found was extremism is based on three key pillars: beliefs, behaviours, and harms. But also in all of those things, there are certain key overarching themes. So with beliefs, for example, there was a consensus around the fact that people felt that beliefs that advocate the restriction for other people's rights or freedoms was a key marker of extremism. People who are threatening or pretending to, people who are supporting for violence or calling for the threat of violence is extremist as a belief. But similarly with behaviours, there were certain behaviours that members of the public thought there was, that defined as extremist. So that included not just the use of violence and inciting violence, but also hatred, harassment, the denial of rights and freedoms, or undermining democracy. And then there were certain harms that people found that there was consensus on. So things like social division, undermining democracy, crime, violence, and harassment. And I think that set us for a really good way forward of trying to then understand, well, okay, we know that violence is clearly violent extremism driven by a particular extremist ideology is something we've already accept. But what really struck me was all of the stuff that we put forward as around hateful extremism, which I think traditionally has been known as non-violent extremism, a term I really dislike. But actually what we showed was there is consensus around the call for evidence that we've got from around the focus groups we've done with NatSen and other people, that there is this idea of hateful extremism based on behaviours, beliefs, and harm, people inciting hatred against others based on extremist ideology and so forth. So that's, I know I've talked about it quite a lot, but that was where we got to in trying to show there is far more greater consensus on what we mean by extremism than is previously acknowledged.
That's very useful. Thank you very much. And in relation to violent extremism that you mentioned there, my understanding is that the commission was established to address what was called non-terrorism related extremism. How difficult has it been to draw that distinction between terrorism related extremism and other forms of extremism more broadly? I say this in the context actually of the commission noting at one time I saw that there was public confusion in relation to the government's concept of extremism and the grey areas between extremism and terrorism. And I think actually in an October 2019 report entitled Challenging Hateful Extremism, you noted that the government should be clear on the difference between work to counter terrorism and to counter hateful extremism. How difficult has it been to draw that distinction?
I mean, I think it's been really critical actually to draw that distinction because as you know, Anthony, there's been 20 years worth of work, not only in this country, but abroad ever since 9/11 around the whole CV agenda. So much of the focus has been on violent extremism. And for me, I've always felt actually we need to be focusing on what I obviously am now calling hateful extremism. And, you know, that's being very conscious and aware that, as I identified and described in the legal review report, Operating with Impunity, that look, hateful extremism fundamentally can help create the climate that's conducive to terrorism, but actually it's a distinct activity in its own right, and it needs to be, you know, and it has to be treated in its own right. Because one of the things that struck me was that if you're trying to use counter-terrorism legislation to attack, you know, to undermine hateful extremism, it's just not going to work, because this is not fundamentally a terrorism problem. And, you know, we can talk about that in a little while. But you're absolutely right about the confusion on the government's definition. What we found from our call for evidence was around 75% of the public and those who responded to the definition to our call for evidence, did not find the government's definition helpful or very helpful at all. And I think that tells you a very clear picture. And certainly that was my view, because it was too broad. It didn't, you know, it wasn't useful in an operational sense either. But I think, you know, having realized that extremism, you know, if you look at extremism, and as I said and mentioned earlier, it's a societal and human ill, you realize there are many consequences of extremism. One of them is terrorism. One of them is violent extremism. You know, when we're very good at knowing how to respond to that, we've spent 20 years talking about it. But there are lots of other societal harms of extremism. Some of that is sectarian hate. Some of that is undermining social cohesion. Some of it is subversion, entryism, infiltrating into, you know, into our public institutions and bodies. Some of it is about extremist groups seeking to mainstream their extremist ideology and narratives and recruiting people to their cause. And a lot of that isn't necessarily always going to fall under the banner of terrorism. So I think that's really, really critical to understand. And I think, for me, trying to show that, you know, we have to have a distinct response tackling hateful extremism from violent extremism, making sure that the public understand that hateful extremism is a different phenomenon, is really critical. Because one of the experiences I had constantly was that whenever I went out there and spoke to people about extremism, and even to journalists in the media, they'd often say, "You're talking about terrorism," and I'd be saying, "No, I'm not talking about terrorism at all." Yes, it can create a climate that's conducive to it, but it's a distinct activity and harm in its own right, which we need to challenge.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a very important distinction to make, isn't it? And actually, you mentioned the Operating with Impunity report that you produced in February 2021. And in that, you identified gaps in legislation that you argued allowed extremists to operate with impunity. I wonder if you could outline what these gaps are and the extent that you think that they are being or perhaps will be addressed.
No, definitely. I mean, it's a 123-page report, so I'll try to summarize as neatly as possible. But I think you'll be aware, Anthony, that successive governments over the years have tried and failed, unfortunately, to deal effectively with those extremist groups and individuals who aren't engaging in terrorism, so therefore they're not caught by counter-terrorism legislation, but who are clearly creating a climate that's conducive to terrorism, or they're undermining social cohesion, democratic norms. And I suppose one of your listeners will be very familiar, if I use him as a case study, is Anjem Choudary. This was somebody for years and years and years. He was openly propagating the idea of establishing a theocratic caliphate in the UK, and did not support democracy, human rights, equality norms. He was openly radicalizing people, recruiting people to his cause. We know that he was allegedly linked to around 70 to 100 Islamist terrorists. And so, I think the fact that the authorities at that time did not have the legal means to stop him, despite all the harm he did, just showed you the failure in our country not being able to deal with, in effect, non-terrorist extremist groups, or what I call hateful extremist groups. It was only in 2015, when he professed support for ISIS, which was a terrorist offence, that he then got caught by counter-terrorism legislation. If he hadn't done that, he would have still been roaming on our streets doing what he did for years and years before. And I think that just shows you the challenge that the government had, that as a society, we had just not handled or dealt with this issue effectively. Now, today, it's not just Islamist groups that continue to exist. I mean, there are groups like Hizb ut-Tahrir, for example, who, again, promoting the idea of an Islamist caliphate, do not support democracy, openly radicalizing and recruiting children to their cause. There are neo-Nazi and neo-fascist groups in this country who are open about wanting to replace our democracy with a neo-Nazi or neo-fascist state, who are not prescribed. And because those organizations are not, they don't meet the threshold for terrorism, they are not prescribed. So I think, I mean, in a nutshell, kind of giving an intro to the problem, I think some of the key things that we discovered, that, I mean, I co-authored this report with Sir Mark Rowley, the former head of counter-terrorism at the Metropolitan Police. And I mean, he was horrified by what he saw as being legal. But I think some of the challenges that we saw was, firstly, that there is no specific legislation designed to counter the activity of hateful extremism. And the two areas of law that we found to be most relevant was hate crime legislation, counter-terrorism legislation. And there was some overlap, for example, on the hate crime side, the incitement offences, incitement around public order offences, racial and religious hatred, for example. There were counter-terrorism legislation, there was some overlap. But largely, there was a whole gap around the fact that hateful extremist activity is not curtailed. I mean, and if I give you an example, say, if we take the example of anti-Semitism, if I decided to send a series of anti-Semitic tweets to a Jewish MP, for example, that would be caught by hate crime legislation. If a terrorist, as we've seen in Pittsburgh and other places, decided to walk into a synagogue and kill Jews, we know that would be a terrorist offence. That's very, very obvious. However, there's a gap in between, and this is where, again, hateful extremist groups are operating with impunity. If I decided tomorrow, Anthony, to set up a neo-Nazi group where I was repeatedly uploading videos online, promoting, hateful anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, glorifying Hitler, glorifying what Hitler was preaching, but I was being careful to avoid abusive and insulting language, that's perfectly legal in this country. If I wanted to glorify Peter Bowers, who committed the terrorist attack in Pittsburgh, which resulted in the death of 11 Jews, again, that if I wanted to glorify him, as long as I was not encouraging emulation, it's okay for me to do that. And again, that's what hateful extremists often do. So again, it just struck us that you've got this gap in the middle where on the hate crime side, it's covered, on the terrorism side, it's covered, but this gap in between of hateful extremist activity isn't. So it was very obvious to us that there's no legislation specifically design with that specific problem in mind. The other thing that we found really shocking was actually what is currently lawful in this country. So and even Sir Mark, who was the head of counter-terrorism for 4 years, whose job it was to, chase after terrorists, so to speak, even he was shocked to discover that it's lawful in this country to glorify terrorism as long as one avoids encouraging the commission, the preparation or instigation of acts of terrorism or related offences. So, for example, if I wanted to praise the 9/11 hijackers, Thomas Mayer, who murdered the MP Joe Cox, Anders Breivik, for example, or any of those other terrorists, which may include promoting him to children, as long as I'm avoiding encouraging, the commission or preparation of terrorism, it's okay for me to do that. Now that just seems totally bonkers to me, and to most, people when you say that to them, because again, if that's not helping to create a climate that's conducive to terrorism, I'm not quite sure, what else does. We also discovered on the hate crime side things that are currently lawful. So intentionally stirring up racial hatred or religious hatred, as long as you avoid being threatening, abusive, or insulting. And I mentioned this argument of, if I set up a neo-Nazi group, praising Hitler, spreading anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, all of that's lawful, and we know there are groups doing that, as long as it's not abusive or insulting. And so there were examples like that were pretty shocking. Another key area that I think I found quite shocking was that even though we know that extremist groups are deliberately targeting and seeking to radicalize children to extremist ideologies, what's amazing is that there is no specific criminal legislation, short of actually directly encouraging terrorism, that criminalizes efforts to radicalize children into hateful extremism. And this is despite the fact that the government, family court judges have said that radicalization should be considered a form of child abuse, because obviously of the vulnerability of children. So the fact that I can go out tomorrow and with intent seek to radicalize children into hateful extremist ideologies, and I can do that lawfully, I think is pretty shocking for many of us who are parents and just as ordinary members of the public. I think that's really appalling. And finally, I think just the other point, which I kind of touched on before, but this idea of the lack of powers outlawing hateful extremist groups. We know that there are certain extremist groups who meet the level for prescription, where the Home Secretary has the power to prescribe an organisation under Section 3 of the Terrorism Act if the Home Secretary believes that the group is involved in terrorism. Now, what you find is there are a lot of hateful extremist groups who are clearly not engaged in terrorism, but they are sharing the same ideology, the same dangerous, conspiracy theories and narratives as terrorists. So as an example, we know that the neo-Nazi group National Action was proscribed in 2016, yet neo-Nazi groups were promoting the same ideology, like Combat 18, British National Socialist Movement, the Order of Nine Angels. All these neo-Nazi groups are currently lawful in our country, which, again, is pretty shocking. And then you look at organizations like Combat 18, and you see how countries like Germany, and I also believe Canada as well, have prescribed this very British neo-Nazi group, yet they are absolutely lawful in our country. And I think, again, that's pretty shocking, because if you look at what we defined as hateful extremism, we made clear that this is activity and materials which is directed at an out-group who are perceived to be a threat to an in-group, where they are motivated or intending to advance a particular political, racial, or religious supremacist ideology, and that they are intending to either create a climate that's conducive to terrorism, violence, and hate crime, or they're attempting to erode and destroy the fundamental rights and freedoms of our democratic society, which is protected under Article 17 of the Human Rights Act. And I think so many of those neo-Nazi groups, Islamist groups, neo-fascist groups who are currently lawful in this country, who are clearly not in the terrorism space, but when you know that they are seeking to replace our democracy with either an Islamist, neo-fascist, neo-Nazi state, where they are saying we need to, for example, deport non-white British citizens, we are going to undermine the rights of Jewish people or Muslim people in this country, they are fundamentally a threat to our democratic order. So our argument was, stop looking at this through the lens of counter-terrorism. There's actually a human rights challenge here as well, and actually using human rights legislation, you can help to undermine and outlaw hateful extremist activity in this country.
Thank you very much for that. I mean, how confident are you then that these concerns that you've raised are actually being taken seriously, or are in the future?
Well, I think it's really important the government has to address it, because, as the legal report title highlights, not prescribing this type of activity is in effect allowing extremists to operate with impunity. And I don't think any government wants to have that on their watch, especially that, we produced this report that shows that so clearly. So I think it's really important for the government to take this into consideration. I mean, I know they are looking at my recommendations. They're obviously waiting for the Prevent review, the findings for that to come through. So I think once that comes through, looking at all of these different recommendations is what I understand the government is then going to consider about how to move forward with counter-extremism.
Clearly, this Operating with Impunity report is a very significant and important one. And indeed, the Commission has also, of course, published other very important ones too. Related to that, how effective, this is sort of a general question really, do you think the Commission has been in addressing extremism in general?
I mean, it's hard when if you're the lead commissioner, the former lead commissioner. I mean, I don't want to praise my own organisation's work, but I think, we had a very, very difficult challenge, as we discussed before, trying to define extremism. For me, when I started, I wanted to make sure there were certain key principles I ran the Commission on. That was including things like being independent and impartial, very much taking an evidence-based approach and engaging, getting out there, engaging, not just taking a top-down approach, but going out there. I mean, I went all across the country speaking to thousands of people, members of the public, speaking to academics, practitioners, victims, just getting out there and speaking to people and learning from their experiences. And I think that was really important. I mean, that's why I did the call for evidence, because I wanted to make sure I heard and gave the opportunity to the British public to share their views. So all of that was really helpful, because when I started, I did not know where this work was going to lead us, but it helped us understand and bring forward this idea of hateful extremism. And we put forward a description of hateful extremism in the 2019 report. It was only in the 2020-21 report we actually came up with a definition, as I mentioned earlier. But by going through that journey, I don't think we'd have got to the legal review and understood where the gaps in legislation is at the moment if we hadn't taken the journey that we had taken. So, I think over 3 years, the work that we've produced, the engagement that we did, and I was very open to listening to people who are quite critical of counter-extremism work. I wanted to hear all sides of the opinion of the coin. That was really important to me. And I think I just, for me personally, I'm really proud of the work that I've done at the Commission. I just think, we've managed to kind of help to fix a problem that years and years worth of governments have tried to do, and they've not been able to do so. And I suspect there'll be other people wanting to put other reports on the table, but at the moment, I think the Operating with Impunity report, there is nothing out there that provides an alternative. So I'm just really proud of the work that I've done at the Commission.
Certainly, absolutely. Thank you very much for that. And moving on from your role as head of the Commission to your current role as the government's independent advisor for social cohesion and resilience, I see that you've recently launched, earlier this month, in fact, a call for evidence to understand people's experience of extremism and its impact on social cohesion in particular. I wonder if you could tell us a bit more about this and what it's intended to achieve.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, what's something that struck me when I was at the Commission actually was, I used to have obviously regular conversations with Neil Basu, who was at that point the head of counterterrorism at the Metropolitan Police. And I remember always having conversations with him, and he'd always speak to me about social cohesion. And I used to always find this fascinating, because I was thinking, here, this is the head of CT at the Metropolitan Police, and he's always talking to me about social cohesion. And I think many people who are in the counterterrorism space, they've always instinctively known that focusing on integration, social cohesion, is absolutely fundamental in trying to counter terrorism. Now, I think, that there is clearly a kind of link between social cohesion and extremism. And I've seen, for example, how when extremism thrives, social cohesion is undermined. When extremists come into power, they actively seek to undermine cohesion. So it's a slightly kind of a symbiotic relationship, because when social cohesion is weakened, you can see how extremism thrives. So I think there's a really interesting relationship between social cohesion and extremism. But I think focusing on cohesion in of itself is really important. Not necessarily looking at it through the terrorism lens, because when you live in democracies like ours, which are incredibly diverse, where there's huge levels of diversity and pluralism, how well we live together is part of the challenge. When people hold such diverse and different views, and especially when those views can erupt over into kind of hatred and violence and so forth. So I think for me, social cohesion is the glue that binds democratic societies together. But one of the things that struck me time and again is how extremists actively seek to undermine cohesion. So they may not necessarily always focus on terrorism, but by God, they are definitely seeking to undermine cohesion, undermining the rights of others, seeking to undermine democratic freedoms. And I don't think in the past governments have really focused on that, because they've been so preoccupied with the terrorist threat, which is understandable. But my argument has been, actually if social cohesion is the glue to our democratic societies, there's a clear link to democracy. And if we're not going to protect social cohesion, and extremists are seeking to undermine cohesion, that is going to fundamentally have an impact on your democracy. And we're seeing extremists, for example, now use, well, I suppose they've always used disinformation, conspiracy theories. What impact do those things have on social cohesion? I think many of us will know that it's been pretty devastating from a whole range of things. So focusing on cohesion, I think, is absolutely critical. Looking at it from a local level, and then understanding what is the role of local authorities in all of this? What's the role of public bodies? The importance of local communities. How do you empower local communities to stand up and challenge extremists in their area, whether they've come into their area or they're from their area? Because again, that's not necessarily easy work. It's quite difficult. But something I do believe is that extremism will always exist in a society. I think for democracies, what does success look like? Well, I suppose success is when it's confined to the fringes of our society. It's not in the mainstream. It's not polluting the mainstream. And we all have a responsibility in pushing back on that and protecting cohesion. So whether that's communities, whether that's local authorities, whether that's you and I as individuals, we all absolutely have a role. But I'm really excited to be looking at this role now on seeing, how do we protect and build social cohesion, and how do we build resilience against extremism? I think, again, that's a whole area of work which I'm really excited to be looking at.
Thank you very much. Again, it'll be very interesting to see what the outcome is of that call for evidence. So thanks again for that. A final question, if I may. Are there any examples that you might be able to share with us of your own personal experiences of countering extremism?
Gosh, well, I mean, yeah, it's very difficult. It's very difficult work. I'm not even going to pretend it's easy. It's difficult. It's challenging. I mean, my experience, I found, particularly when I was running Inspire, it was highly abusive. And I think you do get threatened by extremists. And I've received abuse and attacks from the Islamists, the far left, the far right. You get it from all corners. And in one sense, I think when that happens to you, it just spurs you on even more, because you realize, actually, this work is really, really important. So I think through all the work that I've done and my own personal experiences, I've never seen countering extremism as a job, if that makes sense. It is a cause. You really see it as a cause, because I see it so linked to democracy. And as somebody who believes so passionately in democracy and equality and human rights norms and all the things that our country stands for, protecting that and knowing that extremists seek to undermine that, it really makes you understand how important this work is. It's something that I don't believe governments can ever ignore. Just like governments would never ignore crime as a policy area or as a strategy, I don't believe they can ever ignore the challenge of countering extremism, because it's just something that's always there. And something that's always struck me is that extremists never seem to rest. They're always busy promoting extremism, because again, for them, it's a cause. It's something they fundamentally believe in. And so I think for me and for many of the people who work in this area, they do see this as a cause. And I think when I was at the Commission, one of the things that struck me, we did a poll for those practitioners working in counter extremism, and we found something like 78% of those who work in this field experience abuse, ostracization, threats. And the scale of that was really shocking to me. And I thought, well, this is not just something that happens to me, it's happening to a lot of people. And why are we so bad at supporting those people who are doing this work? And why are we not doing enough to punish perpetrators who engage in this activity? So I think, those issues are really, really challenging. And, anybody who wants to get involved in this work and is listening to this might be thinking, well, I'm put right off now from wanting to get involved in counter extremism. But all I'd say is it's also highly rewarding, because you're making a difference. When I've gone up to places in Middlesex or I've gone up to like Newcastle, and I've heard people tell me how they've challenged extremist groups and made sure extremist rallies didn't happen in their area because they organized the community. You just think, wow, that's amazing. These people are the backbone of our country. They don't get the recognition for it. We don't hear their stories often, but they are there day in, day out trying to do their bit. They might not even necessarily call it counter extremism work, but knowing that this matters to them, to their area, I just think those stories are amazing. And it just shows that as individuals, we can really bring about a lot of change and not to undermine our own efforts in all of this work.
Thank you very much for that. Dame Sara Khan, thank you so much for joining me today and for sharing your experiences and your expertise with us. Thank you so much again.
Thank you so much, Anthony.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Combating Jihadist Terror. We hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to see more episodes, they're available to watch on our website, cogit.org, or to listen to on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Thanks again.